This poem is called The Sierra, A History. Not long after lightning has rushed down the electric staircase of its own making, not long after fires 5 stories tall have swept up canyon, a new season the size of pearls begins. Silences spread like hands to touch the heads of seedlings and forehead, nudging out by the hundreds through ceilings of soil and ashy debris. Ours loose as scree, firming up in tender grips. Here, a stand of charred oaks unwraps its storage of gangly leaves. There, a knot of cones thrown open by heat releases seeds for sun. Currents of brightness are charged from within. Sunlight plucks at the strings of top branches. Up at the crown, blackened firs begin again their story of vigor, edged with new needles. The irresistible music, tinsel and chime notes, wind sending out word, will nose close to the buds to receive all the answers. The burned and crackling world, not in shambles, not gone to ash and ash alone. Sapsucker, pileated, black-backed woodpeckers, all join the jig of genetic diversity. All build from scratch. What do they crave? Riches. Riches hidden in the wide open arches rising from gray.
Hey folks, I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, eco-integrityalliance.org, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the modern ecological crisis. For this episode, our guest is Maya Khosla. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Great. Maya is a biologist and writer focusing on forest biodiversity, post-fire forests, and fire-safe practices for communities. As Sonoma County Poet Laureate, she brought Sonoma's communities together to heal through gatherings, field walks, and shared writing after the recent wildfires. Maya's books include All the Fires of Wind and Light, Keelbone, and Web of Water, Life in Redwood Creek, amongst other writings. We'll be talking this episode a bit about the intersection between science, poetry, environmental advocacy, particularly as it pertains to wildfire and forest, which is the campaign Eco Integrity Alliance is focusing on right now. So yeah, welcome to the Green Room Podcast, Maya.
Thanks so much, Josh.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you're here. And I think I had seen your stuff floating around over the years. However, it was a recent article in Counterpunch that kind of brought it all home, to be written by Doug Bevington, talking about how basically you're combining these, I guess you would call it, the logical, rational, hard science world of biology and ecology, and then the world of poetry and fiction and art, something that I'm actually very involved in as well. So, and then you focus that around lots of different topics, but wildfire and forest. So I guess which came first for you, the science or the poetry?
Oh, definitely the poetry. And I was writing when I was 11.
Excellent. And what sort of stuff did you start writing? Was it about nature or not necessarily?
A lot of it was just a lot of silly rhyming things. Yeah, but it actually, yes, a lot of it was centered in nature because at that time I was in Bhutan. My dad was posted there as ambassador. So, yeah, and we were completely surrounded. We had leopards and bears outside in the gardens at night. So,
And then, so when did the science take root? Because that is a bit of a switch. It seems to be, not always, but a lot of people, they choose one path and not really the other. They're either really into poetry and it's like, it's just about feeling and ideas, and I don't care so much about this science. Or people are like, no, this is the data, and the rest of it is poppycock.
yeah, so the science came a lot later in college, actually. So once I got rooted in the science in college, I stuck with it, but poetry was always trickling in. In fact, I never really gave it up. Maybe I had to set it aside for my thesis, both my master's thesis, but yeah, but I pretty much, as soon as that was over, it was always that relief of, oh my gosh, the muse is back. I can write again.
So those two threads, they coexisted, but did they intertwine right away, or it was at what point in your life where you started to bring the poetry and the science together?
I would say consciously with the first book, Keelbone, because there's a lot of surveys in there, salmon surveys, and actually my very first a burn forest assessment, which was in the Vision Fire in Point Reyes many, many years ago in the 90s. So yeah, so there's several poems in there that are very much rooted in surveys in the field.
Very cool. And keelbone, what does that refer to?
It's the sort of V-shaped bone in the bird that's an indicator to vets, if a wild bird is rescued, if you can feel the keel bone at the chest, chances are it's not going to survive because it's burned up too much fat already.
Oh, very interesting. Oh, that's a fascinating concept. Yeah. So what what a lot of us say activists see, and so you've been advocate, you've been scientist, you've been artist, you've been all the above. I've been advocate, I've been journalist who is a science writer, and I've been artist. But one of the topics that keeps cropping up is the scientist's role or their lack of role in communicating it to the public. So some scientists are like, I put out my studies, that's it. I'm not going to wade into this. I'm not a politician here. I'm not going to corrupt my science. Others try to actually engage and say, well, unless this is implemented, I'm just screaming into a hole. So, Chad Hansen with John Muir Project, he's somebody who does straight up legitimate peer reviewed science in the field. And he also communicates, well, here's the stuff, here are the studies, this should be put into place. And then there are some scientists who maybe try to communicate it, but aren't great at that because it's a different skill. So what's your take on that, the role of the scientist in that?
Um, I do think with a fast moving field like the wildfire sciences, and there's so many developments, starting with Montana, Dr. Richard Hutto, really, Yosemite, the Yellowstone fire was the 89, 88. It was sort of the beginning of, that 20-year study was just, it's classic. Everybody builds on that phenomenal study. And of course, he takes the word on the road as a scientist, leads field walks, and is extremely articulate, writes comments on salvage logging project, etc. He's very visible. If you look him up, Disturbance, I think, features him, this beautiful film about fire up mostly based in the Montana, Wyoming area. And so, you know, and the problem also, well, I don't, I can't say it's a problem. Uh, I personally think it's a problem, which is that the fire science is being flooded in terms of media attention with the extractionist side, what I call the extractionist side. So the minute a paper will come out, all the forests are dying, that'll go straight into SAC B or the Chronicle or something. And you won't have that two-sided approach. So what'll happen is if Chad Hansen or Derek Lee, Monica Bond, Richard Hutto, any of these very well-known, very well-published people put the word out, then it's seen as, wow, they're putting the word out. I mean, they're contacting the media. Nobody realizes how much media attention is given to the extraction side of things, the folks who are being paid by the industries and the agencies who are very much tied in with the industries.
Yeah, well, I noticed that, and I've noticed it for quite some time. And I I did journal. I decided to do for myself. I started as just a pure advocate, activist, saying, "Well, this is what I think. This is what's important." And based on the science. And then I started doing more what's called advocacy journalism, which is it's legitimate journalism. You're taking scientific information, whatever, but maybe you're just doing one-sided, the way basically media is doing unintentionally, maybe for a lot of the industry stuff. Then over time, I decided, I'm going to get all sides of the story here. I'm going to make sure that there is balance, utilizing perhaps my own bias just to even it out and to try as best I can to have balance. Of course, we all have bias, but I realized that, yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky in terms of editors and publishers, really the information they want. And people on the podcast have heard me rant about why I think that is. So I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, which is why I recently started up something called Environmental Media Accountability Report, where what we're going to do is we're going to look at articles that are out there on a given topic. So wildfire right now, and we're going to rate it according to, balance, bias, etc. Just so there's like a little bit of accountability. But in the meantime, yeah, we all have to get better maybe at communicating to journalists and also to the public. So that kind of brings us into what do you think that art communicates to people that say science alone or journalism or even advocacy does not?
So I think that art sort of has its own statement outside of time. You can, by the way, just 5 minutes ago, I saw from Doug Bevington that the DeYoung Museum is featuring Ansel Adams and Laura McPhee exhibition on burnt forests.
Huh.
Um, so it's really beautiful and interesting because you've got this this picture that no one sees because they assume it's a garbage area. You have the world at your feet. You're, for the most part, you're alone, other than during the hunting season when hunters are wise enough to know this is where you're going to get the good stuff. So if it's not hunting season, you just have the world at your feet in these gorgeous places, and it looks like Laura McPhee, Ashwini Bhatt. She's more into the sculpture, ceramic sculpture, but she's interpreted burnt forest in her own way. Apparently, Ansel Adams too. I did not know that, but and so from my standpoint, it's this assimilation of just pure beauty and functionality, which are very much married in the wild world of regenerating ecosystems that can make this tremendous comeback where they left undisturbed or where they have been undisturbed in the past. When I mean logging, they haven't been logged in the very recent past. And then here you are with this body of emotional information, and it's sort of interpreted on the page because it just flows. I mean, that's from my standpoint on the page, and some people will be on the screen. And in some cases, I've tried that too. Or in Ashwini's case, it's a body of work that's just interpreting this landscape and the riches of the landscape. The fact that it's not the end, it's a beginning. My goodness, so it's sort of this meld of discovery and intense. There's just so much life coming at you. There's so many sounds. There's a huge amount of bird diversity. You can, like if you're listening to close to a nest, after a while, you almost have to have earplugs. It's just, it's, it's this astounding amount of information. And I forget the name of, there's a sound person who's done sort of melded the art and the sound graphics, and he's got so many sound files. I'll send that over to you later. Anyway, so it's just it's a statement that stands outside of time. It's just going to last. It's something it can be informed by the sciences, but it's removed. It just has its own life. Its own sort of journey.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you make some really excellent points about, the beauty of burn forests and communicating that to a public that has been, almost kind of brainwashed by industry. They have a reason to not like burn forest because that can cut in on their profit margin, and also then they can exploit that to log media, which I don't think most journalists are like, or getting like payouts. I think they're not super well informed. They're very busy. They have a limited understanding, and they like sensationalism. So the ravaged landscape, the destruction, catastrophic, all that stuff, that makes a more interesting article than nature's just doing its thing. That's not a story in today's journalism, although it should be. And I also think that, yes, to the untrained eye, the lack of greenery may be seen as a negative thing. And, not to get too deep here, but I've talked about this before in the podcast, what I actually think the root of ecological crisis is. I think it's humanity's fear of death, denial and fear of death. So we got to consume, we got to accumulate, we got to anything about not thinking about that. We got to, create more versions of our DNA so it, in theory, lives forever, even though it will not. And so I think maybe that carries over into fear of death of the forest. The areas change. Ew, an ugly, dirty, dead tree. There's soot. But those of us know who have actually spent time in burnt forest, they can be some of the most beautiful areas that even right when they've been killed and nothing has come back, there is a stark, austere beauty to it, a simplicity. It's nature doing its thing. And the last thing I'll say on this mini rant is industry. I've noticed so we've been getting a little bit of media attention to calling out in Colorado here, the wildfire risk reduction logging, so-called, cutting before anything burns to save the forest and humanity miles away, which is based on almost no science, or at least based on science that omits anything that debunks its narrative. And what industry keeps saying about us is like, oh, you hippies and your aesthetics, you just don't like what it looks like, the logged forest. And it's like, no, it's, well, yes, true, because that does mirror its lack of ecological integrity when you make all these right angles in a forest. But it's really, ironically, it's industry and these agencies that they are trying to recreate some Disney-fied park-like forest that only existed in patches. And they're the ones obsessed with the aesthetics, and then trying to be like, look at how ugly it is when a tree burns. So classic projection in terms of psychology.
Yeah, that's one side of it. Just going back for a second to the writings, to the journalist side, I think sometimes there are journalists who are really, really well-meaning, and then there are senior editors and managers.
Sure.
And so, I had one experience like that with really well-meaning journalists, and I could tell they were from CNN. They were just super, super good people, solid on the ground. They really got it. But when the slant that they gave the story was, and this was a Yosemite story, because Yosemite has some clear cuts in it right now for the first time ever as a park. And so we were visiting one of some of the clear cuts, and the story slant was to make the roads fire safe. They're trying to do all this cutting, and here are these people objecting. Whereas where we had gone on foot was very far off the main road, which is obviously an evacuation route in the case of a fire. We'd gone so far out toward this grove of giant sequoias, and they had taken photos of the cuts, but that was not the focus of the story, even though we had all gone there together. And the other matter was that none of these cuts are actually ever going to I think some poetry needs to be written about it, and I've been really experimenting with this.
Uh-huh.
because it's tricky to pack too much information into a poem. It just falls apart. Language is so delicate. It's like this little net, and you put too much weight on it, just like runs holes through it. So, but it's really interesting because the cuts are the places which burn, the cuts and the, you know, the selective thinning places. Mile after mile, I've seen the high severity fires, you know, hit in those places. And you can see here's this massive tree that was taken out long before the fire because of the shape of the stump. It's all burned, reburned, or it's burned into a shape, but you can tell it was a stump before the fire. And then in the backdrop you see these little, you know, sort of matchsticks, and you know that the area was commercial thinned, with all the focus being on the largest trees removed, and these little teenager trees are left, and they burn to a crisp in the fire. And that is where some of the highest high severity fires
Yes.
are. But of course that's being studiously ignored, because then very quick you have to sort of go in at that small window of time after the fire, before the cuts, before the clear cuts, and then you can really take that documentation. um, but if you miss that, it's a clear cut. Now you don't know what happened, you don't know what the story is, but you can really see the story right after the fire. And so I'm just trying to work that into some writing right now.
Yeah, yeah, these are all really important points, and our listeners here have heard all that many, many times, and we know that, right? The journalists sort of kind of do, and it's hard for them to make sense of it or whatever. But yeah, I think you laid that out 100% accurately, and I guess leaving the journalism piece aside, because that is something that we're trying to work on from different angles. Yeah, including this in some of the message in the art to get to across to people. But like you say, it's a delicate thing. So folks may or may not know, I also write fiction. I write horror fiction, and I call it biological horror. And some of, and increasingly more of it, is what I would call eco horror. And I don't want to just beat people over the head per se with a message. I want to explore all angles of it, even the opposite side. Like, I want to do kind of a form of almost balanced journalism in my fiction, because that's what makes the most interesting fiction. But I do have a perspective. And so I guess my question for you would be, yeah, how do you balance that, the desire to incorporate a message, which may be underlying and behind the push to create the art, and then at the same time not wanting to, like, all right, I've got to get 19 points in here, and then I've got to like really make sure people understand this is the right way to think. How do you do that?
Well, in essays, it's fine. It's easy because you can sort of ease it. You know, there's so many, you've got that length and you've got the body of information, and there's a flow to the language. And you can always say, well, God, I've got to insert this thinning piece, pre-fire thinning piece here, because it's such a stark thing and it's informing the rest of the chapter. In poetry, it's a little more tricky because poetry is just, in my view, so delicate. Um, so I would say I could not possibly include more than maybe three in a poem, and they have to come off as really, some of them have to be subtle, and then it's going to be that explanation, maybe the epigraph or something, or the notes, the glossary at the end. So the poem sort of has to stand as a body of work itself. And um, I mean, in all the fires of wind in light, I talk about mourning and mourning, because there is a sense of mourning. Actually, I did feel that myself in my very first burn forest. Was the American fire. It was 2014. We walked into it. It burned in 2013. And exactly what you were saying about ashes and stark, snags and some of the fallen trees. And I just thought, what are we, what are we doing here? And why are we here? It was all these gut level questions, even though there was a big field group and a bunch of us were out, led by, Chad Hansen and Tanya Chi, on a blackback woodpecker survey, the very first sort of survey. And then a blackback woodpecker shows up and disappears. And you realize, no, it didn't disappear. It's right there. It just camoed. I mean, it just sort of blended in as soon as it landed. And there's just this wake up call. And next thing you know, then you start opening your eyes, and then somebody says, well, that tree is actually alive. You can see it's leafing out. And you're like, oh my gosh. And there's this scene in Elemental that I just saw last night, this new fire film by Trip Jennings, Balance Media, and produced by Ralph Bloomer. It's on the road right now. I'm hoping you'll be able to see it in Colorado. And Bev Law has this 20, 30-year plots that she's got these towers, and she's measuring carbon dioxide and uptake, and then she comes back to this 90-year-old forest that burned. And right after the burn, there's a little bit of an aerial right there, right? Like, maybe a few months after the burn, you can see that the green is coming back in all, not all, I would say 50% of the charred, really, really heavily charred trees. If you look all the way up, they're green at the top. And then it becomes a clear cut. And so I caught that because it was actually, I've seen Elemental a couple of times. And I was a panelist, so I was just sneaking in for, before the panel session started. And I was like, wait a minute, those are live trees that they cut. That was part of the salvage logging unit, because no one's going to look all the way up, as a bulldozer is going to look straight ahead, or the loggers are going to look just like, oh, charred tree, cut, charred tree, cut. So it's so interesting. Yeah, so that kind of information, it can't get packed in too much, but it's just like, just that image. Oh wow, that's alive. Okay, cool. And then you keep going with the story.
Right. Yeah, with poetry, yeah, the feeling, the imagery. I used to write poetry. I started with poetry in high school, writing some, yeah, pretty bad stuff like mock Edgar Allan Poe kind of stuff. And then I turned more into songwriting, and that's a little different because you count on the music too, and you don't need to incorporate as much. It's more lyrical than getting really mining the imagery. You don't have to do that as much in songwriting. In fact, you don't want to put too much into the song, whatever. But fiction that I've been writing, I can have more leeway. So you can be a bit more clumsy in fiction, particularly because you can go back. With poetry, yeah, it's like you got to incorporate that magic in those phrases, in the imagery. It's a lot harder to cut and paste and reinsert new things in it. And I'll just use this to pitch my future book that's coming out from Manus Heart Press in this summer. It's called Charwood. It's actually it's a eco horror that is about wildfire and forests and biomass, which I think is the first time anyone bothered to do that, and probably for good reason. No one has attempted it. But what the story is, and just to kind of talk on the topic of combination of art and the science and whatever, is the story has to stand on its own. So for me, the horror, dark, creepy folk horror story, it's all about, you got to have a remote location. You got to have weird practices, like the townsfolk are a little bit off that cliche, but that's folk horror. And then, something building over time usually occurs in nature. And then there's some big event. So you got to have those elements. And then I kind of crafted a story first, and I wanted to make sure to get all the pieces of the biomass stuff. So I basically have she's a well-meaning new climate activist who gets invited to some climate action bonfire, and she thinks it's going to be all about solar panels, and instead they cut forests to burn for biomass energy. And she's like, that seems a little weird, but I don't know. That's all right. They say this is renewable energy. So over time, she gets hired on by them. I'm not going to explain why. There's like a blackmailing horror thing going on there. And then she, over time, is like, this doesn't really seem ecologically viable, but that's not even the main point in my story. The main point of the story is that the reason they're burning trees is a far darker reason. So then I go into pure horror story, but I really try to get the whole perspective, and like coming in from somebody who is like, oh, okay, this makes sense, which is, how your average individual is, and then starting to peel away the layers. So I tried to do, like a steel man as opposed to a straw man. like, straw man is you have the other side and you deliberately make the argument stupid. I didn't do that. I deliberately put the strongest arguments that industry and agency has for cutting forests and the wildfire nonsense or whatever. And then she starts seeing the different pieces. So I don't know if I'm successfully accomplished that. We'll see what happens. But my allegiance, most of all, was really to the story. And I do hope I also got the ecological point across, but not just in a like school marmish way. We'll see.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm biomass energy extraction is my latest focus because it's such an indiscriminate removal. In the past with salvage logging, there was this size, quality, that kind of thing, and some leave in place, but not now. Now it's all scrape it to the bone and get it all out of there. You know, that's what's
Yeah.
happening.
And I wonder if, I mean, my book, I don't know how much that will accomplish, but, doing more art. So poetry, maybe it's film, maybe it's music, maybe it's fiction. The points that we've been trying to communicate for many, many years, I think are slowly catching on with the science and whatnot. But what I learned about being an activist was, okay, the people who agree with me will pat me on the back, and everyone else just kind of ignores me or hates me. And then with journalism, I feel like I had a little more opportunity to reach a broader audience in that, say, they would pick up the Boulder Weekly anyway. They're not just, obviously Boulder Weekly would be a left-leaning kind of publication, but still it would reach a broader audience. But I also noticed still that the people who cared about the article are the people who already agree with it. I think it's very rarely that people change their minds that way. They have to feel it. But in art, you feel it, or you live through the eyes of a character. I think books like The Giving Tree that I read as a kid, where it's a little kid and there's an anthropomorphic tree basically that is giving itself to this boy, and you just feel that the joy of the tree's gift, and then kind of the despair at the end when the tree has given everything it has. And I think that's going to be more powerful than, nothing against scientists, activists, or journalists. It's going to be a million times more powerful than any of that information.
Yeah, I mean, and again, nothing against, well, it's, I would say when someone opens their eyes, they have a responsibility to keep them open. It doesn't matter whether they're a scientist or a journalist or an artist. And obviously you've had your eyes open for a long time on this stuff. I think that one of the most disturbing trends that I'm seeing that I can't seem to interpret into art, and I'm struggling with it, is the lack of citations. So there's this selective group with a body of work that's informed by industrial interests and talking constantly about extraction, regardless of the beautiful, some of them are high quality data, etc. But the conclusions are always going to be extraction related. We got to get more out of the forest. It's overcrowded. We got to thin them out. And then there's another, of course, group with the independent scientists or someone who's sitting in the middle, even like Max Moritz, who just recently put together a press about in a publication about the biodiversity of forests after fire. You got these key publications, 20 years of study by more than 20 years of study by Monica Bond, Derek Lee, who's a professor in a university right now. You've got Chad Hansen's work, William Baker, who's professor emeritus. I mean, we're not talking about a group of people without institutional backing, but they're not being cited in a basic paper about biodiversity of post-fire forests. So in other words, what is happening where the industry-based or funded scientists are then just sort of saying, is this because, in interpreted in the law, if they don't cite it and if they deny that that body of science exists, then they can defend that better, their perspective better in a court of law. I can't understand it, but it's something that I think it's a new thing that's happening. Let's say maybe 5 to 10 years old. And I think, the only time you'll see everything discussed is when they take other people's work out of context and sort of try to break it down. But sort of, to me, I'm just grappling with that, because how do you can't go that far into some, analyzing this very dangerous trend where, they're essentially forcing people to keep their eyes closed.
Yeah, well, that is a tough thing to tackle in general, much less through art. I mean, yeah, I mean, that latest study that came out from Baker, Williams, and Hansen and Della Sala, which basically, I think that's one of the biggest bombshells. We've been putting out press releases about it. I've gotten, well, actually, there is one local Boulder Weekly here is supposed to do an article on that, but not only did the agency studies funded by USDA Forest Service and a whole bunch of logging entities leave out the information about these other studies that debunk their narrative, namely the idea that prior to fire suppression, all Western forests were park-like Disney forests, and not never dense and pretty much only low severity fire. The data shows otherwise. So not only did they leave that information out, oops, they knew it damn well, because some of their co-authors even had that in their own studies, and that's just left out. So I think at this point it's clearly intentional. I mean, I don't think it's a mystery as to why it's being done, but I think it's the classic in-group, out-group, and the independent scientists are not in the in-group and their stuff doesn't count. I mean, right? Isn't that the way they look at it? Which, of course, the only science that is really legitimate is the independent science, because it doesn't have any strings attached.
Yeah, and that's what, I mean, media needs to understand that there's two bodies of information that are essentially not talking to each other. We can make them talk to each other in film. I have, and I am doing that. But they essentially didn't, well, actually, that's a mistake. One body of science, like the independents, are talking about all the science there is.
Sure.
And then the industry dependent people, the agency industry complex dependent scientists are denying, they're just sort of putting it on the shelf as, or maybe not even that, not even pretending it doesn't exist. So that's really, in their meaty discussions, they just shelf, just like sort of deny that whole body of information, whereas the other group doesn't deny any information at all. It just integrates everything together, which is how it's supposed to be. Sort of. I mean, what happens to you when you try to tackle some of the big presses? They just say, "Oh, we can't handle that."
They don't even respond.
Oh.
Yeah, no, they don't. They don't even respond. Why would they? Yeah, I mean, it's and my insight as a journalist, going back to all that, I played in the journalism field for real. Like I became. Everyone has bias. I'm like, no, I'm gonna do these articles better than these other journalists in terms of going deeper on the side that I actually think is wrong, and double checking that. I did that for years and years, and I found I ran up against some headwinds in other ways that I'm not going to get into. I got into that in the other podcast, but yeah, it's not enough on their radar, and they don't read the studies. They've admitted this to me. So here's the thing, not to toot my own horn, because I don't actually think I'm that great, but I won a lot of awards during my brief time of just focusing on journalism. And why? Because I read studies and took longer to write the articles. That's it. That's the only difference between me and these other journalists. It wasn't that they weren't capable of it. I mean, they were trying to knock off like 7 articles in a day, whereas I would like write 1 article a week and really go in depth, which was also part of my demise as a journalist, because it's like, that's pretty obvious there. You got to churn it out and churn it out. But no, they admitted to me recently, is like, yeah, I'm not going to read the study. It's like, well, read the conclusion like it's a paragraph, or read the abstract there. Like, well, I just want to hear. So I've been quoted recently as an activist in some articles as, so Josh Schlossberg, some guy, thinks that the forest used to be dense. I'm like, I don't think that. Like, I'm just communicating the science. Like, my
Right.
opinion on this, you can have my opinion about, like, oh, I feel like it's a bummer or whatever to cut down beautiful forests, but I was like, please don't quote me as the source of the science, because I'm not a credible source other than an interpreter of the science. They didn't do that on purpose. They're just
Yeah.
yeah. So I found that the two classes of journalists that have the most hope are the new journalists who have yet to become completely brainwashed. So they're like, oh, yeah, that does seem a little weird that they're cutting down the biggest trees when they said that they would protect those. And then the veteran grizzled journalists who don't give a shit if industry doesn't like them, or is like, and tells their editor, we're going to run this through. We've gone over this before. They'll also write a good article. It's the ones in the middle. They're a bit, they think they know stuff, but they don't. And they're very, beholden to whatever the status quo is. So that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, yeah. I met some Berkeley photographer filmmakers very recently, a couple weekends ago. They're still going to college, and I was stunned because I, sort of said, "Hey, so you guys are doing sort of invasive pig documentation here." It was in Pinnacles, and you're most welcome to check out some of the burn forest work. And I've been busy filming, doing some of that with primarily remote cameras for the mammals right now. And she said, "Oh yeah, I would love to follow up with you because I'm really interested in all the cleanup they're doing." Well, I said cleanup. What are you? He's like, "Yeah, but there's fuels reduction projects, and then there's cleanup." And I said, "Well, both of them are different types of clear cuts. You know that, right?" And I was just explaining. I said, whatever side you've been exposed to is one side of things, and if you walk into forests, you're going to see a whole nother side, because if once you clean up a forest, I find with camera stuff that nothing comes there anymore. I mean, they just pass through, they whip through, or they just turn back. um, Go where there's cover, where's all the layers are available to them for hiding, for viewing, for hunting. It's so it's not just William Baker et al. Think that there was variability in forests. Yes, some were open and park-like, some were highly dense. Surprise, surprise. You don't have one size fits all in nature, but also the animals themselves are answering that question by either being there or not. The blackbacks, the northern goshawk will select. I've gone through 3 goshawk nests. I know that's not a lot, but everything I see and everything I hear about, it's got to be a certain amount of density, a little view in the front, sort of a platform, and that nest placed strategically 2/3 of the way up the tree. And there's some density, there's some undergrowth, there's this feeling of being in some kind of a little chamber, a forest chamber, with the burn right next door, actually. Not after it was clear cut. That one got clear cut, and she didn't return. I mean, it was a sort of a lightly burned section right next to where she was hunting, and the male too, for their nest, which was high severity burn area. But of course, that's all gone now, and they haven't come back. So it's just, they're the answers. They're answering the question just as much as the scientists with all the data are answering the questions.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's really important. Um, just to sort of wind things down here, it's like, so photographs and film, that's just not as much in my realm. I guess I'm less of a visual person, or whatever. Um, but obviously you show people photographs of things, it can communicate in different ways. I think it's all needed. We need the journalism, we need the science, we need the activism, we need poetry, we need fiction, we need music, we need photography and film, we need all of it. So I don't think one is necessarily more important, but I think there's a lot less of, say, the poetry element that is that feeling. And then I think photos can also emit that, and particularly if you have a film with video and music, you're kind of getting all of the above, and then you can even insert some poetry. But there's a phrase I heard the other day that I think is pretty darn accurate, and I'm curious what you think about it and maybe how it applies to art. Is so a lot of people are just have that knee-jerk burn forest bad, mess, clean it up, dead, whatever the heck. So they haven't really been reasoned into that. They haven't really like logically like it's just sort of a feeling or kind of a fear thing. So the quote that I heard was, paraphrasing, you can't reason people out of a belief that they didn't reason themselves into. So in that case, logical argument ain't gonna cut it. But do you think that maybe art in whatever its form might be the way to sort of short circuit that for people like, oh, what do you think?
I do. I am confident that art is one of the most powerful ways to sort of reframe that kind of thinking, so that because you're dropping fear out of it. That framing that you talked about, where they went into that belief system and can't get their way out of it. It seems to me that's fear based. It's definitely fear mongering in the media, but it is fear based. So, art tends to just like sort of drop all those other layers, and then you just face the art. It's just that pure art, that moment.
Yes, indeed. And I do think that there is hope in that. In time, people are going to see this stuff. Like as there is more, unfortunately, I think it has to get a lot worse before it gets better. Like here, they're clear cutting and cutting down 130-year-old trees in Colorado, which that's kind of a big deal in Colorado for this stuff. It in some of the most popular parks in, well, not just the state, but in the country, because this is a pretty populated area here, and everyone loves to hike here. So I think the more that people see, the more they're like, whoa, they're doing this everywhere. And then also the more of the fuel reduction stuff that ends up burning or burning hotter anyway, and then going into communities regardless. I think over time, more and more of that evidence is going to show that this stuff isn't the way to go about it. So do you have hope that in time will tell all?
I do, and I do. I just think, yeah, like your big concern, my big concern is a critical mass, a groundswell of people. And of course, that's where, the extraction side has the edge because they have media control at this point, it looks like. There's got to be other ways, and say, for example, like a small poem in a good big magazine, it Forrest Gander wrote a poem called about the burned forests. I had gone out there with him and his wife Ashwini Bhatt, and it appeared in the New Yorker, and it looks like sort of a doom and gloom type of poem. I mean, it's a sense of mourning. It's expressing a sense of mourning. At that point, well, they produced a podcast on it. It's a New Yorker podcast on Forrest Gander. And if you look at it, if you listen to it, you hear him say, well, the timber industry is in bed with the Forest Service, and that's why these places are not known to be rich, beautiful places. They're just getting clear cut left, right, and center. And he actually says that, so the poem doesn't say it, but when he explains it in the podcast, it's really clear. So, we're inching along, and I think the art is the hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. Well, thank you, Maya, for taking the time to talk to us and come on the podcast, and for all your work. Where can folks find your work, whether it's science, film, poetry? What's the best way for people to see the stuff that you're putting out into the world?
Oh, I mean, I do have several publicly available small videos, shorts that are being built into something bigger on Vimeo, which is like the word video with an M instead of the D, Vimeo. And I have a website, mayakhosla.com. So
Great. Well, folks should definitely check that out. Yeah, you're definitely at the intersection of so many of the pieces of communication to the world. And so, yeah, I really appreciate all of your efforts.
thanks so much. And I look forward to your new book. I'll look it up.
For sure. Well, I'll definitely get you a copy of it.
Thanks.
Thank you.